started with the dog. A quiet, obedient creature, old and slow, the kind of companion that never caused trouble. For years, Bruno had been the old man's faithful friend, spending his days lounging at his feet and his nights curled up beside his bed. But something changed. It was subtle at first, little things that could be brushed off as quirks of age. Then, one night, the old man woke to find Bruno sitting rigid at the foot of his bed, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. At first, he ignored it, chalking it up to an old dog's restlessness. But it happened again, and again. Every night, without fail, Bruno sat perfectly still, eyes locked on him, unwavering, unblinking. The old man tried calling his name, snapping his fingers, even nudging him with his foot, but nothing broke the trance. It was as if Bruno was watching something, waiting. Then came the growling, low and guttural, deep in Bruno's throat, the kind of sound that sent shivers down the spine. The old man's home had always been a place of quiet comfort, but now, an unseen presence seemed to lurk in the corners. Doors creaked when no one was near. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. The air felt wrong. Unease settled in his chest like a heavy stone. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly off. So he did what any rational person would do. He set up a security camera in his bedroom. If something was there, if something was disturbing his dog, he would see it. But when he finally checked the footage, his heart nearly stopped. Because what he saw wasn't just Bruno staring at him. It wasn't just an empty room. No, it was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't have been there. And the moment his eyes landed on it, a cold dread sank into his bones. He wasn't alone in his house, and whatever was watching him had been there all along. The night had a suffocating stillness, the kind that made even the faintest noises feel deafening. The old man's house, once a sanctuary of warmth and quiet solitude, now felt like something else entirely. Something cold, something watching. The wooden floor groaned under his weight as he paced his bedroom, the dim glow of a single bedside lamp casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. Every corner seemed darker than usual, every silence heavier. And then there was Bruno. The dog sat like a statue at the foot of the bed, his body rigid, his unblinking eyes locked onto his owner. There was something deeply unnatural about it. This wasn't the lazy, affectionate companion the old man had known for years. This was something else, something distant and alert, as if Bruno saw something lurking in the unseen spaces of the room. His breathing was slow and deliberate, his ears twitching at sounds the old man couldn't hear. A chill crept up the man's spine as an invisible weight pressed down on his chest. He swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease, but it only deepened when Bruno let out a low, throaty growl. It wasn't aggressive, but it was steady, deliberate, a warning. The kind of sound that animals make when they sense something they don't understand, something they fear. The old man turned toward the door, suddenly aware of how the darkness beyond it seemed thicker than usual. His fingers hovered over the bedside lamp switch, the thought of being plunged into complete darkness making his pulse quicken. He didn't believe in ghosts. He didn't believe in things that went bump in the night. But as he sat there, frozen in place, he realized something chilling. Belief didn't matter. Something was here whether he accepted it or not. The old man, Harold Whitaker, had lived in that house for over 40 years. It was small but sturdy, tucked away in the quiet outskirts of town, where the nights were darker and the silence stretched for miles. He had never minded the solitude. In fact, he welcomed it. After his wife passed a decade ago, he found comfort in the predictability of his days. The morning coffee, the evening walks, the gentle rhythm of life that never asked too much of him. And through it all, there was Bruno. Bruno had come into his life as a scrappy pup, a gift from his late wife, Margaret, back when Harold still had laughter in his voice and warmth in his home. The dog had grown old with him, his muzzle graying, his movements slowing, but his loyalty had never wavered. They understood each other in a way only longtime companions could. Harold talked, Bruno listened, and together, they filled the emptiness. But now, that quiet companionship felt different. Bruno's recent behavior had shattered the peaceful monotony of Harold's life, filling it instead with an unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The dog had always been calm, predictable. He never barked at nothing, never acted skittish or afraid. Yet, over the past few nights, Harold had watched his old friend transform before his eyes. The stillness, the staring, the growling. It wasn't normal. It wasn't Bruno. Harold had tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just old age, maybe some kind of canine dementia. But deep down, he knew better. The air in the house had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by a coldness that settled deep into his bones. Shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't. Strange sounds crept through the silence. He felt watched, not just by Bruno but by something else, something unseen. Still, he didn't speak of it. Who would believe an old man rambling about eerie feelings and a dog acting strange? His son, David, called once a week, but their conversations were short, polite, surface level. David lived across the country, busy with his own family, his own life. Harold never wanted to burden him. He never wanted to be the lonely old man who made up stories for attention. So he did what he always did, he carried on. But as he sat in his chair that evening, watching Bruno's stiff, unblinking form, a deep sense of dread settled in his chest. He wasn't imagining this. Something was wrong. And for the first time in years, Harold felt truly afraid. Harold couldn't sleep. Not anymore. Every night, he found himself lying awake, heart pounding in his chest, eyes flicking toward the foot of his bed where Bruno sat, motionless, staring. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, like something unseen pressed against his skin. Even with the heavy blankets pulled up to his chin, a chill crept through his bones. He tried to tell himself it was just the winter air seeping through the old wooden walls. But deep down, he knew better. Bruno never used to act this way. The dog had always been a creature of habit, curling up on his rug and snoring softly through the night. Now, he didn't even blink. The first few nights, Harold had tried to ignore it. He'd rolled over, shut his eyes, and willed himself to sleep. But it was impossible. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. The worst part wasn't Bruno's eerie stillness. It was the way his eyes shifted, just slightly, as if he wasn't looking at Harold but at something just beyond him. By the fourth night, Harold couldn't take it anymore. He sat up abruptly, flicking on the bedside lamp. The warm glow did little to ease his nerves. "Bruno," he said, his voice hoarse from sleep. The dog didn't move. "Come on, boy. What's gotten into you?" He snapped his fingers, patted the bed, even nudged him lightly with his foot. Nothing. Bruno's gaze remained locked, his body rigid. Then, without warning, a deep growl rumbled in his throat. Harold stiffened. His mouth went dry. "What is it, boy?" His eyes darted around the room. It was empty, nothing but the familiar furniture, the soft creak of the house settling. But the growl only deepened, a sound so primal, so filled with warning, that Harold's pulse spiked. He reached for the baseball bat he kept beside his bed, a habit from years ago when the thought of an intruder still seemed like a possibility. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but every instinct screamed at him to be ready. He moved through the house, flipping on lights as he went. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway, nothing was out of place. But the wrongness in the air was undeniable. It clung to the walls, seeped into the floorboards. He checked the locks, front door, back door, windows. Everything was secure. And yet, as he stood in the middle of his darkened home, bat gripped tightly in his hand, he felt the strangest sensation, like he wasn't alone. A shiver crawled up his spine. Maybe he was going crazy. Maybe this was what happened when you got old. Your mind played tricks on you, twisted the quiet into something sinister. But then he looked down at Bruno, still standing at his side, still staring at the empty air in the hallway, and he knew this wasn't in his head. Something was there. That was the night he set up the camera. It wasn't paranoia, he told himself. It was just precaution. He had an old security system installed years ago but had never really used it. Now he dusted off the cameras, set one up in his bedroom, another in the living room. If something or someone was lurking in his house, he'd have proof. The next morning, he barely got through his coffee before opening the footage. The bedroom camera played first. At first, it was nothing. Just Harold asleep in his bed, Bruno lying on the floor. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., Bruno sat up. His head snapped toward the far corner of the room, his body tense. Harold frowned, leaning closer to the screen. He dragged the playback bar back, playing it again. The same moment, the same movement. He could feel his heartbeat in his ears. Then something changed. The air in the footage seemed to shift, distort. Just slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But Harold saw it. A dark ripple in the corner of the room, almost like a shadow, but wrong. It wasn't cast by anything. It moved. His breath caught. The distortion grew, spreading like ink in water. And then, for the briefest second, a shape emerged, humanoid, towering, its form obscured by the static-like interference. It didn't have a face, just a void where its features should have been. And it was watching him. Harold recoiled, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. His hands trembled as he paused the footage, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. No, this had to be a trick of the light, a camera malfunction, something logical. But Bruno had seen it too. He had reacted to it before the camera had even picked it up. A wave of nausea hit him. His house, his home, wasn't just haunted by memories anymore. Something else was living here, and now it knew he had seen it. Harold couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. After watching the footage, a cold dread had settled into his bones, refusing to leave. He sat in his chair for what felt like hours, staring at the frozen image on the screen, at the shifting darkness, the faceless figure. He had lived in this house for nearly 30 years, had walked its halls in the dead of night without a second thought. But now, every shadow, every creak, every shift in the air sent his heart hammering. Bruno lay at his feet, ears perked, his body still as a statue. The dog knew something was wrong too. He always had. Harold exhaled shakily and forced himself to shut the laptop. Maybe he was losing it. Maybe this was nothing more than an old man's paranoia. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had seen something, and now there was no unseeing it. That night, Harold sat up in bed long after the lights were off. He could hear the wind outside, rustling through the trees, the faint hum of the old heater kicking in. But beneath all that, there was something else. A feeling, presence. He turned on his side, glancing toward the foot of the bed. Bruno was there again, sitting upright, staring at the same empty corner. But this time, his body trembled slightly, as if he was fighting the urge to run. A bead of sweat slid down Harold's temple. "Bruno," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The dog didn't react. A sudden creak echoed from the hallway. Harold's breath caught, his body tensed, every muscle locking up. He turned his head toward the bedroom door, his ears straining for any other sound. Silence. His fingers gripped the sheets tightly. It was just the house settling, he told himself. Just an old house making old house noises. Then the doorknob rattled. Harold bolted upright, his pulse roaring in his ears. The sound wasn't loud, but in the suffocating silence, it might as well have been an explosion. His mind raced. Was it the wind? A draft? Had he forgotten to lock the door? Then, as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. For a long moment, Harold just sat there, frozen in place. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. Slowly, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet meeting the cold wooden floor. His hands trembled as he reached for the baseball bat beside him. Bruno let out a soft, almost pleading whine. Harold hesitated, his fingers tightening around the bat's handle. He didn't want to go to the door. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to pull the blankets over his head like a child and wait for morning. But he had to know. Taking a deep breath, he stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. The floor groaned under his weight as he took slow, measured steps toward the door. His heart pounded against his ribs, a relentless drumbeat in his chest. He reached out, fingers hovering over the doorknob. The air felt thick, charged, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath. Then, just as his skin brushed the cold metal, knock, knock, Harold stumbled back, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. Someone was on the other side. No something. Bruno erupted into a low, menacing growl. Harold clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He took another step back, his mind racing. There was no reason anyone should be at his bedroom door. The house was locked. There was no way in. And yet, knock. Knock. Harder this time. More insistent. Harold's grip tightened around the bat. Who's there? His voice was hoarse, unsteady. Silence. The seconds stretched unbearably. Then, from the other side of the door, a whisper. A voice so faint he almost thought he imagined it. Harold. His stomach dropped. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. The voice wasn't familiar. It wasn't human. Bruno barked, loud and sharp. His body pressed low to the ground, teeth bared. Harold's entire body shook. He took another step back, then another until the back of his knees hit the bed. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The air returned to normal. The door stood still. The house fell into eerie silence once more. Harold didn't move for what felt like an eternity. He waited, listened, but there was nothing. Eventually, he forced himself to sit down on the bed, the bat still clutched tightly in his hands. He didn't sleep that night, and when morning finally came, he made a decision. He was going to check the cameras again, because now, more than ever, he needed to know the truth. Harold sat at the kitchen table, the laptop open in front of him. His hands trembled as he moved the cursor, clicking on the new footage from last night. He hadn't slept, hadn't dared close his eyes. Every time he tried, he heard it again, the whisper. His name, spoken in a voice that did not belong to anyone he knew. Bruno lay at his feet, ears flat, eyes darting toward the hallway every few minutes. The dog hadn't eaten since the night before, and Harold felt the same pit in his own stomach. Something unnatural had entered his home. He took a deep breath and pressed play. The footage began as it always did. Harold, tossing in his sleep. Bruno, sitting at the foot of the bed, watching the empty space by the door. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Then the doorknob rattled. Harold's pulse quickened. He fast-forwarded. The knocking, his reaction, his slow steps toward the door. Then, the moment he had dreaded. The whisper. In the footage, Harold froze in place, just as he had in real life. But what came next made the blood in his veins turn ice-cold. The door opened. His breath hitched. In the video, the door creaked forward an inch, then another. A darkness seeped through the crack, shifting unnaturally, like living shadow. It spread along the floor, stretching toward Bruno. The dog backed away in the footage, trembling. Then a shape, a figure. Harold slammed the laptop shut. His pulse roared in his ears, panic clawing up his throat. He had seen it, a form standing just beyond the doorway, not fully visible but there, watching, waiting. Bruno whimpered beside him. Harold's mind raced. He had spent 30 years in this house, lived in it longer than anywhere else. But now it felt like a trap, a prison closing in around him. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands. He needed help. The line rang once, twice, then the lights flickered. Bruno barked, scrambling to his feet. The phone call dropped. Harold turned toward the hallway. The air had changed, thick and suffocating, pressing against his chest. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed deeper than before, unnatural. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming toward him from the hall. Harold gripped the bat. He could barely breathe. "Who's there?" His voice came out weaker than he wanted. Silence. Then, a whisper, slithering through the air like something alive. "Harold." The kitchen lights went out. Bruno let out a feral growl, stepping between Harold and the darkness. Harold took a step back, his heart hammering. He had spent all night thinking about what to do if this happened. But now, faced with the thing inside his home, he had no plan. Then the figure moved. It stepped into the faint glow of the laptop screen. A tall, gaunt silhouette, its limbs unnaturally long, its head slightly tilted. It had no face. Harold choked on a gasp. The thing took a step forward. Bruno lunged. A snarl ripped through the silence as Bruno leaped at the figure, teeth bared, his body colliding with the darkness. The room exploded into chaos. Growling, hissing, the crash of furniture toppling over. Harold didn't think. He ran through the hallway toward the front door. His hands fumbled with the lock, his breath ragged. Behind him, Bruno yelped, a sound of pain and defiance. Harold turned, his gut twisting. Bruno was still fighting. The shadowy figure loomed over him, moving unnaturally, shifting like smoke. But the dog refused to back down. Harold's fear twisted into something else. Rage. He gritted his teeth and gripped the bat tighter. "Hey!" His voice came out louder, angrier. The figure paused. His head snapped toward him. The faceless void where its eyes should have been locked onto him. Harold charged. The bat swung through the air, colliding with something solid. Yet not. The impact sent a pulse of cold through his body. But the figure staggered. Bruno, emboldened, lunged again, his teeth snapping at the creature's shifting form. A terrible screech filled the air, piercing, unnatural. The shadows recoiled, twisting violently. Harold didn't stop. He swung again and the figure shattered. Like smoke in the wind, it dissipated, sucked back into the darkness of the hallway. The lights flickered back on, and just like that, it was gone. Harold stood there, panting, his entire body trembling. Bruno slumped beside him, exhausted but alive. Silence filled the house. The air felt lighter, normal. Harold dropped the bat and sank to his knees, his heart still pounding. He looked down at Bruno, stroking the dog's fur with shaky hands. "You saved me," he murmured. Bruno licked his hand, his tail giving a weak wag. Harold exhaled. He didn't know what that thing was, where it had come from, or why it had chosen him. But one thing was certain. It was gone. For now. Harold sat on the porch, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The house behind him was quiet again. Too quiet. It was strange how something so familiar could suddenly feel like a stranger, like a place he no longer belonged. Bruno lay beside him, his body rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The dog had fought harder than Harold ever could have imagined. He reached down, running his fingers through Bruno's fur, feeling the warmth, the life. If it weren't for him, Harold might not have made it through the night. His mind replayed everything. Bruno's strange behavior, the unsettling whispers, the dark figure lurking in his home. He had lived alone for years, never once feeling unsafe. But now he wasn't sure he'd ever feel safe again. Was the thing truly gone? Or was it just waiting? Harold exhaled, his breath visible in the morning air. He knew one thing: he would never ignore the signs again. He had spent weeks brushing off the warnings, convincing himself that fear was irrational, that what he couldn't see couldn't hurt him. But he had been wrong. Fear had saved his life. Or maybe it wasn't fear. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was trust. Bruno stirred, letting out a quiet sigh. Harold gave a tired smile. "Guess we make a good team, huh?" The dog thumped his tail against the wooden porch. Harold looked back at the house, the place he had called home for so long. He wasn't sure if he could stay, not after what had happened. But leaving didn't feel right either. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. Or maybe this was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps us bring you more spine-tingling stories. And tell us in the comments, what do you think was truly haunting Harold's house? Was it a spirit, something far more sinister, or just his own fear taking shape? We'd love to hear your theories. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that'll keep you up at night. We have plenty more eerie encounters and unsettling mysteries coming your way. And if you think you'd stay in that house after what Harold experienced, well, let us know. Would you fight to uncover the truth? Or would you run and never look back? Drop your answers below, and we'll see you in the next terrifying tale.